Thank you very much, Paul, and Ambassador Motse, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here, though on an anniversary, very somber occasion. After Chernobyl, it was often said in the West that such a thing could not happen here. And by the West, I mean OECD, including Japan. And it was not explained much why it couldn't happen here, but it was supposed to be safer and better, and that was the Soviet Union. It happened over there, and it couldn't happen here. And I used to remind people that the same accident sequence couldn't happen here because that was a different type of reactor. But the same scale of consequences could certainly happen here. And tragically, we don't know the scale of the consequences yet of the Fukushima tragedy, but we know that it is far worse than any nuclear reactor accident in the West, and much more comparable in scale to Chernobyl than to 3 Mile Island. And so it's important to understand, my charge is to give you some technical background, so I'll try to do that, and throughout I'll try to give you some perspective between what went on then and what is going on now. Ironically, the Chernobyl accident started with trying to fix a design problem in the emergency core cooling system. That's the system that you need if you have a failure of regular cooling and power, and your emergency generators must come on and immediately cool the reactor, because there's so much radioactivity that even when the reactor is shut, your fuel rods may melt down, the water may boil, and then you get pretty severe releases of radioactivity. And the designers of Chernobyl type reactors, the RBMK reactor, which was very different than the light water reactors in the sense that there was a huge graphite block in the core of this reactor used as a moderator. And graphite, of course, is carbon, and carbon can burn. There had been an accident before with a fire at Windscale in Britain in 1957, and somewhat different type of reactor, but also had graphite. So they wanted to make sure that there would not be a gap between loss of power and the emergency diesel generators coming on to supply the cooling. And they decided that the emergency generators would take too long, a minute or more, to supply full power to start pumping emergency water into the reactor. And they were doing an experiment as to whether the residual power in the steam turbines and the generators could supply power to the pumps. And so they actually did an experiment in a reactor full of radioactivity, 1,000 megawatts. 1,000 megawatts is 1 million kilowatts. 1 million kilowatts electrical is 3 million kilowatts thermal. Just to make it real, each one of us generates about 1/10 of a kilowatt of heat just from the food we eat. So that's our metabolism rate is 1/10 of a kilowatt. Chernobyl was 3 million kilowatts thermal. So 30 million people worth of heat was being generated in this reactor. The experiment went terribly wrong. It was supposed to be carried out at a certain power level. It was supposed to be done in the daytime, but apparently there was a demand for power in the daytime, and they were told to do it at night. The people who had the unfortunate job of doing it were not fully prepared to do the experiment because they were not supposed to have done it. And the experiment, the whole procedure started around midnight, and they were supposed to lower the power enough but leave enough power in the turbine generator that it could power the pumps for about a minute till the diesel generators took over. That's the system they were testing. Emergency core cooling, continuously, essentially without a break. The first problem that happened, the reactor is controlled by control rods. In this case, you lower the control rods to decrease the rate of reaction, and you raise them to, in the Fukushima reactors, it's the reverse. The control rods are inserted from the bottom, but the idea is the same. The control rods were inserted too far. The reactor power dropped much farther than would be necessary to do the experiment. Then the control rods were withdrawn too far and the reactor power increased, and you had an unstable regime in which steam started being generated in the reactor, and a runaway reaction started to take place because the power started to increase. Now, I've told you that the power in the reactor, the maximum rated thermal power of the reactor was about 3 million kilowatts, and in a few minutes, in a few seconds, the power increased to about 100 times the rated capacity. Is that right? I think 100 times is correct. A virus ate up my notes about half an hour before I came here, so I don't have all the numbers down, but I believe that's right. Tom, do you remember? Okay. When the power increased so suddenly, you had an explosion. You had a steam explosion. The reactor building was destroyed. There was not a secondary containment building that was robust as at 3 Mile Island. And then there was a second explosion shortly thereafter, and a fire. And the fire lasted for 10 days. But one thing that happened that was quite extraordinary that we have not taken enough note of until the Fukushima accident is when the graphite started burning and there were explosions, hot pieces of graphite that were on fire were blown out of the building and landed on the turbine building of the neighboring reactor. And the roof caught fire and some pieces fell inside the turbine hall of the next building, reactor number 3. Turbine halls have hydrogen that cools the electrical generators to get maximum efficiency. The workers over there put out the fire along with the firefighters outside. If that had not happened, there was a real potential that hydrogen in the turbine buildings would have caught fire, and then we would have had a multi-reactor accident. We did not learn from Chernobyl that there was a potential for a multi-reactor accident and building more than one reactor at the same site. Till this day in the United States, we continue to consider licenses for adding reactors to existing sites without revisiting the fact that there are already reactors there and you could get major damage. The firefighters put out all the fires except the main graphite fire by about 6 o'clock. It was a pretty huge and heroic effort. But there was another major problem that is less known, is at the bottom of the RBMK reactor, there's a suppression pool. You've all seen diagrams of Fukushima, the torus. There was a pool at the bottom of the reactor, and once the fuel was melting through the concrete, if it had reached the water at the bottom of the reactor, there would have been another explosion. And 3 people went down into that highly radioactive water and opened the gates so that firemen could put hoses in and pump out the water. Otherwise, it would have been an even much worse accident. I want to reflect a little bit on the contrast and comparisons with Fukushima. Fortunately, at Chernobyl, there was not a multiple reactor accident. And we are very fortunate that there was not. And we're fortunate because there were some very brave workers who had a great deal of presence of mind to replace the hydrogen in the generators with nitrogen. And it is because of the alertness of those workers that it was not much more serious than it was. At Fukushima, sadly, we have an accident with 7 major sources of radioactivity in trouble. And there is something that had happened there for the first time, which is a spent fuel pool containing radioactive waste, along with an active reactor core that had been emptied into it in unit number 4, has apparently lost cooling, generated hydrogen, and there's been a hydrogen explosion, and you have seen the destruction of the buildings. Yet, we are not really learning the lessons from that, at least as rapidly as I would like. We have spent fuel pools in this country, and I'm sure that the second panel speakers will address this, but I just want to note that in the middle of the Fukushima crisis, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission relicensed Vermont Yankee, which is about the same age and the same design as Unit 1 in Fukushima, for another 20 years. And Vermont Yankee spent fuel pool has more spent fuel in it than all the 4 spent fuel pools at Fukushima that are in trouble put together. Most of that fuel can be removed into dry casks, but the Nuclear Regulatory Commission did not order that. The larger lesson for me, and one of the reasons I wrote my book, Carbon Free and Nuclear Free, on a dare essentially from my friend and mentor, S. David Friedman, who's the father of energy policy in this country, is he said 5 years ago about this time that, and he has run the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power and so on, and he said we should get rid of coal and we should get rid of oil and we should get rid of nuclear and go to solar. And I didn't think it was feasible. And he's challenged me to actually do a study rather than offer instant opinion. And so I did, and I concluded that actually we can have a renewable energy future, and that I think should be part of the debate. Maybe we should consider whether we can make nuclear energy safer, but I would suggest this should be an occasion for us to consider whether it makes sense to make plutonium and fission products just to boil water. That's what a nuclear reactor is, it's just to boil water. I believe this idea of boiling water is sort of firmly planted in the middle of the 20th century. And maybe we ought to think of it, at least I think it should be a fresh debate. Thank you.